It is funny what can bring people together. If there's one thing that can unite lifelong Coalition and Labor voters, it's a shared hatred of the Greens. Look, to be honest, I hadn't intended to do another video about the federal election. I figured I'd pretty much covered it all in the first two, but apparently not. Not enough coverage of the Greens' bloodbath, apparently, so here we go. I think it's fair to say that for the Greens, like the Coalition, the 2025 federal election did not exactly go the way that they'd have hoped. The talk in the lead into the election was that the Greens were looking to hold their 4 lower house seats while targeting 5 additional seats. In terms of the Senate, there didn't seem to be any real expectation there besides retaining the 11 Senate seats they took into the election. At the end of election night, the Greens' hopes of gaining further ground in the lower house were cactus. The Greens would start the 48th term of Parliament with 1 seat in the lower house and 11, at the time, now 10, seats in the Senate. Look, no one's going to argue that losing 3 lower house seats was a good result for them. But a bloodbath? That's probably a little detached from reality. So let's take a look, because there's no shortage of theories as to why the Greens didn't perform as well in the federal election as they'd have liked to. If you were to listen to their hardcore critics, the election results for the Greens were due to them being too extreme, or it was because they weren't the party that they once were, or they were just a party of protest, or Albo's personal favourite,
the Greens political party have lost their way.
Whatever that means. But let's set that aside for a moment and let's start with some reality. And that is, the idea that voters abandoned the Greens or that their vote tanked just isn't supported by facts. Nationally, the Greens' vote, both in the lower house and the Senate, held. It didn't collapse. Their share of the first preference vote in 2025 for the lower house was 0.05% less than 2022. And 2022 was the highest share of the first preference vote they had received in their history. Right, so I think we can all agree at this point that the idea that voters abandoned the Greens in 2025 isn't supported by actual data.
Hey, what happened?
So then why did they lose 3 seats? Prior to the 2022 election, the Greens held 1 lower house seat. In 2022, they picked up 3 additional seats, whilst receiving their highest share of the primary vote in the lower house in their history. But the increase in votes in 2022 doesn't necessarily explain why they picked up those 3 additional seats.
Hey, what happened?
Let's talk about preferential voting. Australia's preferential voting system is like a political reality show where voters rank candidates, from their favourite to their least favourite. If no one wins a majority of first place votes, the least popular candidate gets voted off and their fans' next preferences are counted, Survivor style. This elimination party keeps going until someone finally gets over 50% and is crowned the winner of Democracy Idol. Preferential voting is a beautiful thing, but by virtue of how it works, it can mean that minor shifts in voter preferences can have large impacts on individual seats. And to an extent, that's what helped the Greens in 2022. Let's look at the seat of Brisbane. In 2022, in the first preference vote, the Greens' Stephen Bates finished 3rd. The Labor candidate was 2nd, and the Liberal candidate finished out front in 1st. Despite leading on the first preference vote, the Liberal candidate's vote still collapsed in 2022, with a decent chunk of the voters that had abandoned the Liberal Party giving their first preference to one of the minor parties instead. As the candidates with the fewest number of votes were eliminated, their preferences were redistributed. Stephen Bates received a higher number of preferences from these minor parties than the Labor candidate did, which allowed the Greens to overtake Labor and move into 2nd place. Labor's preferences were then redistributed, with a large number of those flowing to the Greens, which enabled the Greens to cruise past the Liberal Party to take the seat. I guess the strange thing about this in 2022 that was observed by quite a few people was that when right-wing minor party candidates were eliminated, their preferences generally favoured the Greens over Labor. This didn't happen in 2025.
Those who live by the sword die by the sword.
While the Liberal vote continued to drop, preferences this time ultimately favoured Labor, with Greens' preferences, when redistributed, flowing to Labor, allowing the Labor candidate to jump into 1st place this time. And essentially a very similar thing happened in the seat of Griffith. In 2022, the Liberal vote collapsed, but they held just enough of the vote to hold 2nd place after first preferences. After Labor preferences were ultimately redistributed, this gave the Greens enough of the vote to take the win. In 2025, the Liberal vote continued its downward trend, causing the Liberal Party to slide to 3rd on first preferences. The Liberals preferenced Labor higher than the Greens. The bulk of Liberal preferences then flowed to Labor, and therefore Labor took the seat. Obviously, there are other factors that contributed to the Greens losing these seats, but the very nature of the 3-horse race was was the most significant one. In cases like the Queensland seats, where the Libs have started to consistently lose ground, they still have a massive impact on the outcome. There's the possibility that in seats where their preferences ultimately decide whether or not Labor or the Greens win the seat, they could start playing funny buggers and preferencing against the sitting member to flip the seat every 3 years. Don't know what it'd achieve, but it might be entertaining. If you're trying to get your head around these three-cornered contests, The Guardian have a cool little interactive tool you can mess around with to help explain how they work. Yeah, but what about Adam Bandt, I hear you ask?
What happened?
He saw a big swing against him in his primary vote. Yep, he did. So does that prove that the Greens have lost their way? Well, no, not really. Yes, Adam Bandt's primary vote dropped significantly, but there is an explanation for that other than just the vibe, yeah? The fact is, the seat of Melbourne had its electoral boundaries redrawn, meaning Melbourne lost a big chunk of traditional Green voting booths, while gaining a bunch of traditional Labor voting booths. That brought what was once previously thought of as a fairly safe seat into play come the 2025 election. That, along with a couple of factors that we'll come to, ultimately contributed to Adam Bandt's loss there. Bit of a segue here, but one thing I always find interesting with elections is, what I reckon anyway, is a bit of a quirk in the Australian electoral system, and that is the impact of concentrated versus distributed support. So take the Nationals, and I'm excluding the Queensland LNP here. Their share of the primary vote is concentrated on specific seats. By nature of the coalition, they don't run candidates everywhere. The Nationals won 9 seats this time around, whilst receiving less than a third of the primary votes that the Greens did. The Greens nudged almost 2 million primary votes nationally, but they ran candidates almost everywhere, so their votes were distributed widely, and in turn they won a single lower house seat. To take it a step further, Katter's Australia Party won the same number of seats as the Greens, 1, yet it recorded just 50,000 votes. 50,000 votes versus 1.9 million votes. That's a big difference, but it ultimately returned the same result, a single seat for both parties in the lower house.
Boring.
So we've covered the factual data-driven explanation for why the Greens lost 3 lower house seats, but what other reasons might there be for the Greens performing below their expectations? First up, let's talk about the right-wing lobby groups. 2 of the more prominent groups that I saw during the election were Advance, fronted by this gremlin, who were hoping to frighten voters toward the coalition, and Better Australia, who were trying to scare people away from the Greens and community independence. If you want a deep dive on Better Australia, check out this interesting read on Michael West's site. In terms of this election, Advance were one of the big spenders, pushing out all sorts of hot garbage, the sort of stuff that would send a Sky After Dark host running for a cold shower. In the 5-week election period, they spent over $1.7 million on social media advertising alone, and a lot of their money was spent targeting specific seats the Greens either held or were hoping to win. It would probably be a little naive to try and argue that Advance's campaigning had no impact. When you spend as much money and spray out as much messaging as they did, some of it's going to find a home, no matter how bad the overall campaign is. But I think in this case, rather than pushing voters toward the open arms of the coalition, it would appear that if Advance did anything, it was to help the Labor vote, something that, as Crikey report, even Advance seemed to acknowledge privately. It's hardly the result I'd imagine their donors would have been hoping for when handing over millions and millions of dollars. It's worth noting that Advance have also been reported as having helped bankroll campaign materials for other anti-Greens third-party groups, which just even further muddies the waters. At this stage, it's hard to say what real impact Advance had on the Greens in 2025. They'd probably argue that without them, the Greens vote would have grown. Maybe, maybe not. We'll probably never know. But to suggest that the Greens' primary vote was in terminal decline thanks to their actions, well, I think that's laying it on a bit thick. Brisbane and Griffith saw a minor drop in the primary vote, but as we've already seen, it was the collapse of the Liberal vote that impacted the eventual results there more than anything else. I'd imagine that Advance and other anti-Greens groups would have campaigned quite heavily in the Seat of Melbourne, which, given the result there, I guess it's plausible that their campaignings had some sort of impact there. In a seat like Wills, a seat Advance is said to have also targeted, the Greens' primary vote actually increased.
Yeah, but what about...
Then there's the miscellaneous stuff, the stuff that's even more difficult to quantify. How was the Greens' actual election campaign? I have to say, from a personal perspective, had it not been for my interest in politics, I'm not sure I'd have even known the Greens were running candidates in this election. Now, the caveat with that, I guess, is that where I'm living at the moment, it's not Greens territory. They'd have run a candidate, but I couldn't tell you who it was. I reckon I can recall seeing a single lonely corflute at one point, and that's about it. And I'm guessing that's true of a lot of electorates. While the Greens may run a ton of candidates, they have finite resources, leading them to target a handful of seats. You only need to look at the spending discrepancy between Labor, the Coalition, rabid third parties like Advance, and then the Greens to see it's not really a level playing field. I would guess that the Greens aren't on the receiving end of millions of dollars in donations from fossil fuel donors, so that puts a bit of a handbrake on their campaigning. When they're being significantly outspent by parties and lobby groups attacking them, you'd think that would have to have at least some impact on the overall result, even if only minor. Spending less means they'd need to be much better at targeting and running localised campaigns, but even then they'd be the underdogs.
That makes perfect sense.
In terms of general messaging, the only thing I can recall seeing was Adam Bant on TV talking about keeping Dutton out and getting the Labor Party to act.
For real change, to keep Dutton out and to get Labor to act, vote One Greens.
Which seemed to be the general theme of their messaging. I mean, it was simple enough, I get it, but I kind of wonder what the less politically engaged voter would make of it. Lots of people view politics in Australia as binary, Labor versus Coalition, so if they were to hear keep Dutton out messaging, perhaps that would actually make them more likely to vote Labor. Look, I don't know. That's just an unformed thought I have. I've got nothing to support it with, so.
How dare you come in here?
Do I reckon that the Greens' stance on housing and delaying the passing of the Housing Australia Future Fund for a few months caused Green voters to jump ship? I think that's highly unlikely. I reckon there were times during Labor's first term that the Greens were a more effective opposition than the Coalition, and this clearly aggravated Labor and Albo. The Greens playing hardball and finally wringing some concessions out of the government before passing the bill could maybe be seen as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it put housing on the national agenda and allowed the Greens to stand up for the 1/3 of the population that are renting, a group historically not particularly well represented come election time. On the flip side, delaying the passing of the Housing Australia Future Fund bill gave the government all the ammunition they needed to position the Greens as blockers, as a party standing in the way of progress. I don't think the Greens digging their heels in to push for something better here would have had a material impact on their base. I wouldn't be surprised though if it led to Labor paying more attention than they'd normally would have to the seat of Griffith, which may have made Max Chandler Mather's job a little harder in that specific seat. That is, when he wasn't making life harder for himself, which leads us to, what about that time Max Chandler Mather shared the stage at a CFMEU rally? Really, I can't imagine that it did him any good politically whatsoever, particularly given everything that was being reported in the media about the CFMEU at the time. For the Greens' opponents, the images of Chandler Mather on stage gave them plenty of material to run their party of protest lines. But by the time the election came around for the less engaged voters, realistically it was probably all forgotten. In Max Chandler Mather's seat specifically, maybe it caused him to shed a few votes. But nationally, come election time, I really don't think it was a big factor.
Like sands through the hourglass.
So to summarise, I'm probably going to disappoint a lot of people, but the truth is the Greens' national vote didn't collapse. A decrease of 0.05% from a previous record high primary vote is more than respectable. The decrease is that small that we're talking rounding error type stuff. You can essentially say their national vote remained unchanged from 2022. The nature of the three-corner contests and the collapse of the Liberal Party vote was the primary reason why the Greens lost the 2 seats in Queensland. The seat of Melbourne was slightly different. Rezoning moved the seat from a fairly safe one to a seat that was going to be in play come election night. The well-funded attacks and Adam Bant being the face of the evil Greens chipped away enough of Bant's lead there that Labor were able to scoop past him thanks to Liberal Party preferences. Real enemy of my enemy kind of stuff. But we should remember here that in the three-corner contests, so long as the Greens retain the bulk of their primary vote, it's only going to take a small swing from Labor to the Coalition again to put a bunch of those seats back in play. Overall, the Greens' position in the Senate remained unchanged post-election, and they held their ground. Even after the defection of Dorinda Cox to Labor, the Greens will still hold the balance of power there, which puts them in a strong position. In all honesty, I don't believe the Greens have lost their way. I think that's largely a narrative being pushed by groups that would rather see them gone. However, I do think that going forward they need to pick their battles. There are times where they risk looking opportunistic. I think popping up at the CFMEU rally could probably be seen as an example of that. If you were trying to feed into the radical left party of protest trope, popping up there was a good way to go about it. And given that they're nowhere near as well resourced as the major parties, they probably need to have a think about what they want to achieve and whether or not pouring resources into trying to gain ground in the lower house is the way to go or not. The 2025 result was not what they'd have liked, but it was hardly the bloodbath or death of the party that the Coalition, Labor and right-wing shite factories like Advance would dream of. The election should have served up a sobering reminder for the two majors. The fact is, when it comes to the primary vote, the major parties are in steady decline, and they've been trending downward for a long time now. The 2025 election was the first in history where minor parties and independents combined received more primary votes than one of the major parties.
Yeah, but what about the...
So we know the Greens vote didn't collapse. The party wasn't abandoned. So why didn't their share of the primary vote increase? I think there are probably a combination of factors behind that, but this will largely be vibe-based, unquantifiable stuff. First, I think the negative campaigning from third parties would have had to have taken some skin off the Greens. I don't think it would have influenced engaged voters, but for those turning their mind to voting a few days before the election, or just on their way to the booth, it's hard to see that it wouldn't have influenced at least some people. The fact that broadly the Greens' chief critics all locked in on some very similar messaging would have helped reinforce the third party campaigning. I would not be at all surprised to find that the total campaign spend across all the anti-Greens third parties will end up exceeding the Greens' own national campaign spend. And when you throw enough shit, don't be surprised when some of it sticks. Second, I think the Keep Dutton Out message likely directed some potential voters over to Labor. I would not be surprised if undecided voters, upon hearing the Keep Dutton Out message, decided the best way to do that was just to vote for Labor. Some will probably argue that the Trump effect came into play in the last month or two as well, and maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Third, I think as the last term wore on, the number of cases the Greens were attempting to prosecute became unsustainable for a party of their size, potentially making it harder for a less engaged voter to really identify what they were standing for. As an example, for much of the first half of the term, they were advocating for renters. Whether that continued into the second half, it's hard to say. Maybe they did, but if so, it seems to have just got lost amongst everything else. And last, but most importantly, given the polling over the entire term, I'm not sure anyone should have reasonably expected the Greens to have secured a higher share of the primary vote in the first place. The fact is, they consistently sat within the 12 to 13% for the primary vote for the past 3 years. Rationally, their only chance of gaining ground in the lower house was never going to be the result of a massive shift in primary vote. They were always reliant on a few more of those three-corner contests falling in their favour, and relying on those is not a sustainable pathway for growth. This consistent polling result, a result that aligns with their election result, is important to recognise when thinking about what went wrong for the Greens. I mean, I've talked about delaying the Housing Australia Future Fund and appearing at the CFMEU rally, and I've said that I don't believe that either had much impact on the Greens' result. And I think that this aggregated polling, as well as the eventual election result, is the best evidence that we have to support that view. Based on the polling results, neither action appears to have led to an increase or decrease in support for the Greens at the time, so it's only reasonable to conclude that neither action had much impact on the eventual result either. At the end of the day, I think that maybe, just maybe, this is where the Greens are at for now, and that maybe in the current political climate we've reached peak Green. That's not to say that there's no opportunity for them to grow from here, because there is, but a lot of that will depend on how Labor perform in the next term. At the same time, they'll need to figure out how to work constructively with the government to demonstrate that they can help deliver on improving what the government is putting forward without looking as though they are just blocking the government's agenda. And that's going to be a difficult balancing act. And if they fail there, they do risk going backward. I always find it interesting anytime I post anything Greens related or even mention them, because like I indicated from the outset, they're a honeypot for two distinct groups, the Labor faithful and Sky News fiends. They really bring those two groups together.
Says you.
So there you go, that's my honest analysis of what happened to the Greens at the 2025 federal election. This one may not have been cutting enough for some, but then again, it's probably hard for some people to get their head around the fact that anyone would post videos on this sort of thing without being on the payroll, directly or otherwise, of a political party. I get it, it's fair to be sceptical. And I do get why people assume I'm some sort of Green sleeper agent, because I do spend a fair bit of time talking about the kind of stuff that they'll often talk about. I believe in science, and I believe that continuing to approve and extend massive fossil fuel projects is not a good thing, and that giving away our natural resources for next to nothing to massive multinational corporations is shite. I think housing should be a human right, not a speculative investment asset. I think that the governments we've had, whether they be the Coalition or Labor, helped create the housing crisis we're seeing now, and they've both done very little to try and resolve the crisis. And a lot of the issues around cost of living can be traced back to the housing crisis. I believe in transparency and that the country needs a strong anti-corruption commission, and I also believe that Labor and the Coalition have let Australian whistleblowers down badly. I think broadly, quite a few of those themes probably align with where the Greens stand today. But then again, there was probably a point in time where they would have aligned with Labor as well. For me personally, I can't see myself ever aligning to a single party. In my view, going down that path means that sooner or later you're going to have to compromise your own principles, values or beliefs, support something you don't agree with, or be forced to defend something you know is wrong.
You're an idealist.
I much prefer being a free agent, a swinging voter, probably the sort of human political parties hate.
I don't understand you.